Welcome to Temple Micah, or welcome to Virtual Temple Micah, and our evening's panel discussion with our own team of Micah medical experts, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Just this afternoon, I did a brief calculation. Today marks almost exactly 26 weeks or 6 months since our Micah community went virtual. I remember Thursday, March 12th, very last date that we had an in-office meeting. Remember leaving the office after a meeting with my colleagues, Rabbi Crawley and Rabbi Braha, then a follow-up conversation with our executive director, Rachel Gross. We turned out the lights, turned on the alarm, and left. Never did we imagine that we would be gone from meeting with each other in person at our beautiful building for such a lengthy period of time. That evening and the next morning, we planned our first virtual Shabbat services, and since then, it's all been Zoom. Like every other synagogue across the land, we have reinvented contemporary American Jewish life. Even as we were putting in untold hours figuring out how to design and fly the synagogue simultaneously, so to speak, we were also making plans last spring for what we were certain would be in-person reunions. Certainly by the fall, we were brainstorming a great Rosh Hashanah reunion, a joyous Simchas Torah. Slowly it set in, perhaps too slowly, that we are in a marathon, not a dash, not a mile race, not even a 10K. Each and every step of the way, we considered as a community how best and most safely to face the deadly virus that knows no geographical boundaries. We have been advised by medical experts whom we all know well. They've been remarkably generous with their time to help and advise our community. To be sure, it is rather remarkable that we have such expertise within our own congregation. I'm enormously grateful to each of them. They are so generous each time I've reached out to them to ask for their counsel. But we're not here this evening to hear me ramble, so I'll briefly introduce our panel. They're with us once again. Dr. Manya Magnus is professor and co-chair of the Department of Epidemiology at the Milken Institute of Public Health at George Washington University. Dr. Richard Katz is Chief Medical Officer at Mount Washington Pediatric Hospital and Professor of Pediatrics at Johns Hopkins Medical School. And Dr. David Skorton is President and CEO of the Association of American Medical Colleges. Dr. Skorton will serve once again as moderator as well as panelist as we learn what to expect this fall and winter as we hear news of vaccines and the like. Please follow our conversation closely and use the chat box to send in questions, which we hope we'll make time for towards the end. Dear panelists, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Zemel, and everyone at Temple Micah for making these webinars possible. I also want to add my thanks to those of the rabbi, to Dr. Magnus and Dr. Katz, and also to the staff of Temple Micah, especially Rachel Gross and Deborah Winter, for doing all the things that need to be done to make these webinars possible. So here we are. Summer is unofficially over, and we're facing the fall. And we're facing the fall with a lot of uncertainties. Will there be a surge or another wave, so to speak, of the coronavirus? What will the contribution of the influenza season be? Will it be confusing to people if they fall ill, whether they have symptoms of the flu or symptoms of COVID-19? And what about vaccines, both for the flu and for COVID-19? We're going to touch on many of these topics tonight and leave plenty of time for those joining us to ask us questions and share their own observations. I want to focus just for a moment, not on a scientific topic, but on the topic of social justice. And I want to ask you to join me in thinking beyond the very important personal concerns that we all have at a time like this, concerns about our own health, about our livelihood, about our families. And I want to think about the fact that we're coming up on the High Holy Days in just a matter of days, and thinking about the very strong strain of social justice in all the major religions, but in terms of tonight's focus, in Judaism. And we often use the phrase tikkun olam to talk about healing or repairing the world, and also to call your attention to a particular parashat in Deuteronomy and Devarim Parashat Shoftim, where it says, justice, justice shall you pursue. So as we think about the fall in terms of our own welfare and well-being, I hope we will also turn our efforts and our thoughts toward the vulnerable communities in our midst, those who are poor, those who are homeless, those who are incarcerated, those who belong to groups, especially Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, who have suffered enormously disproportionately from COVID and probably will continue to do so. So with that in mind, we're going to ask our two expert panelists to share some slides, and then we're going to open up for a very long and I hope a very active question and answer period. So thank you again, Rabbi Zemmel. And now I turn it over to Dr. Magnus. Manya, it's all yours.
Thanks so much. All right, great. Hopefully you can see my slides now. Yes? Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about where we were. And I'm going to reflect on where we left off last time we were together in the same forum back in April, and where we are, and then where we're going to be going. I have no conflicts to disclose, and I just want to highlight that I'm an epidemiologist, so medical questions really should be directed to your care provider or on my two co-panelists. So I was looking back at where we were last time, and what impressed me was how much everyone knows now. Everyone knows what epidemiology is, and we were talking about that last time, was defining epidemiology and teaching Epi 101 for everyone in the Temple Micah community. We now all undeniably know who Dr. Tony Fauci is. You understand most likely the difference between case fatality rates, incidence rates, positivity rates. You know what a prevalence is. You know what a new case is. You understand the difference between an RNA PCR antibody test for the antigen test. Oops, sorry, hold on. You understand the difference between log scales and absolute numbers, population adjusted rates versus absolute rates. You know what an R naught is now. You understand the importance of a false negative and a false positive when we think about COVID. You clearly already understand the value of placebo-controlled randomized trials. And you also know most likely that where we were before, there were no effective treatments, and we now have some modestly effective treatments that have already come into place in terms of remdesivir and dexamethasone and other corticosteroids. So I just want to give everyone an honorary degree right here in epidemiology. So you've earned that, and I hope everybody will accept how much we've all come collectively as a society that we know so many things together. I want to take a brief look at where we were globally, epidemiologically. You might have also seen this Johns Hopkins dashboard, which really is an amazing resource. Back in April, when we met earlier, there were about 1.2 million cases globally and only 68,000 deaths. And here we are now, 27 million cases. The United States has about a quarter of them and almost 1 million deaths. And again, we have about almost 23% of them. So things have changed. Now, sometimes as I tell my students in epidemiology, it's really important to remember that as we have millions and millions of cases, sometimes we can lose touch with the individual numbers, and those are incredibly important. For every one of those millions of people who have been sick or died is a family, is a child, is a parent, is a sister, or is a brother who is affected by their loss. If I look here, these are some local data. You can see the citations on the bottom if you're interested in seeing your own rates. We have our Arlington County, District of Columbia City, Montgomery, and Prince George's counties. And you can see how many people have been sick. And then on the rightmost column, you can see how many people have died in our own midst. So it's important to remember that these numbers are not just academic, they are people. And each one of these is a person we know had love in their life and had some loss and suffering. As Dr. Skorton mentioned earlier, it's important to remember the disparities. The disparities are pronounced with this disease, and it's critical that we recognize these and work quickly and collaboratively to try to reduce these disparities. Nationwide, we see that Black populations are dying at 2.5 times the rate of white people. And you can see those here. These are adjusted by deaths per 100,000 people by race or ethnicity. And you can see here they're vastly out of sync with the rest of the communities. And this has to drive our action. You can see other groups that are widely affected, that Black, Indigenous people, Latinx, and other people of color are profoundly affected by this disease, in addition to people with comorbidities. And you see a lot of intersectionality. So we see that so many characteristics that come together in terms of race, gender, poverty, access to care are highlighted here in this pandemic, especially in the United States. And here's a CDC comparison here, which you can look at later if you'd like, but it highlights that in terms of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, we continue to see a highly disproportionate impact of communities of color. So I also just want to highlight here that we also are acutely aware of this this pandemic of racism that's also occurred, and we have incredible systemic and structural racism, and we have the brutality that we are experiencing here. Police brutality in the country is overlaid this incredible disparities in COVID. So on the one hand, we can look at this as two separate pandemics, or we can look at them as parallel pandemics that highlight each other and call us to more swift action. So I know there's a lot of interest in the vaccine trials, and I wanted to just very briefly just mention some of them, and I'm sure we'll take more questions later. But the New York Times has a nice coronavirus vaccine tracker, and you can see here the phase 1, which are the first in human trials, sort of to look at the initial impact of the drug on healthy populations, all the way to approvals are sort of tracked. There are actually about 91 that are in preclinical states, I've heard, who before they even get into human bodies. And what we're interested here is how quickly this has happened. And I think last time I talked a lot about silver linings. The silver linings are amazing. That we have gotten this far along so quickly is quite remarkable. We have here the phase 3 efficacy trials are about 9 in large scale phase 3 trials. I want to highlight some of the work that we are very fortunate to be a part of, which is with the Coronavirus Prevention Network. And you can see their work at the preventcovid.org site. There's a lot of information there for those of you who are interested. My particular HIV Prevention Trials Network site is a part of this effort. So many of the clinical trials units that are run by NIH have been asked to be part of this network. And so that is how we are participating. It's an amazing advance that we've been able to get up and running so fast. Here at George Washington University, through our HIV Prevention Trials Network site, we are working on the Moderna vaccine, which people may have heard of. It's a phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled trial. If you're interested in learning more about it, we can certainly tell you. You can write to me. You can volunteer for this and all of the CoVPN vaccine trials at that volunteer screening registry on the bottom. If you're interested in participating or volunteering locally at the George Washington site, here's our website for our registry for volunteers. So I just want to round up by saying, in terms of what I had on my last slide last time, some things don't change. So there's still an enormous number of things that we still can and must do. We have to pay attention to communities at greatest risk. I think we highlighted those epidemiologically in the data, but those communities who are at greatest risk, they have too little safety net. Their challenges to employment, healthcare access, stable housing, food security, et cetera. They've been vastly impacted not only by the pandemic, but also by all the impacts of the pandemic, including the economic downturns. It's critical that everyone continues mask wearing, social distancing, hand washing, and other practices. That we can't speak highly enough. We don't have a vaccine yet. We don't have great treatments. And until we get those, it's critical that we continue these behaviors. And it's also important to notice that mask wearing behaviors and eventual vaccine uptake behaviors are not that different. We really need to look at the behavior of these types of prevention activities if we want to actually shape what happens next, even if we get vaccines in the future. I encourage everybody to continue to notice that science is evolving and we just are learning things now. And just because we knew something yesterday doesn't mean it's true. We have to keep our minds open, let science be the judge, and keep being dynamic and letting things grow. We don't know all the answers. And just because we're wrong yesterday and we learn more today, that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Get a flu shot. That's critically important, more now than ever. Elect leaders and political representatives who value science and public health. So please don't forget to register to vote if you haven't already. Listen to scientists and physicians. None of that's changed. And just remember that this is not, as he just said, it's a marathon. This is not a sprint. So it's going to be a long road ahead as we identify new vaccine strategies, new treatment strategies. And it's really important to remember that this is definitely not the first pandemic and it won't be the last. So let's start thinking now about what happens after COVID, because hopefully this will be over pretty soon. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Dr. Richard Katz.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My slides are going to be sort of a representation of every question I've been asked over the course of the last 6 months, and tried to put it in some semblance of medical science order to make sure that it seemed to be fairly reasonable. The first slide, you've probably seen this picture of the illustration of a COVID virus, not because it's so pretty, but because the spikes on the COVID virus are an important part of how antibodies are going to be made to help us develop vaccines, to at least one of the ways of developing vaccines to help overcome this. So on the next slide, we'll just do a brief review of things that we've seen and learned since the beginning of this epidemic. COVID-19 is one of a group of RNA viruses. The genetic material is RNA in this virus. Many viruses have DNA as well, which are the basic building blocks of life for all of natural living organisms. But it's a similar organism to the severe SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome of a few years ago, the MERS, Middle East respiratory syndrome, and common cold viruses. Well, at least that's what we thought at the beginning, and it was similar to those. It does act very differently than all of those, and it's turned out to be much more difficult to overcome and to treat. The spikes that are on the surface of the virus are the parts that attack particular parts of the body. This virus, we thought, just to like to attack the respiratory tract. It turns out it attacks many more places in the body, and those spikes are what used to attach themselves to cells in the body. The virus then enters the cells, replicates, and then this results in the death of cells, but leads to disease consequences. But it also leads to the spread of the disease throughout the body. And as you know, despite what politicians say, this may not be the China virus, but the first reports did come from China. And the origin of it being from a bat is still highly controversial. So we can go on to the next slide. Dr. Magnus covered the epidemiology. It's just always important to remember that the United States is really, with all of our advanced medical science, we do account for 1/4 of the cases in the world, 1/4 of the number of deaths in the world. And sadly, despite the fact that we think we capture the number of people who are infected, most people think that the positive cases really only account for a fraction of those who are truly infected. So there may be, 10 times the number of people who have no symptoms, but who are carrying the disease in their body. If we can have the next slide. As we talked about, the transmission is primarily person to person through close contact. And what we believe now is that the primary mode is through respiratory droplets, simply coughing, sneezing, even talking, singing, blowing shofars are ways to transmit this disease. And that's probably the most common, the most deadly way of attracting the disease. You don't want to attract it, but get the disease. It does occur if your hands have become infected by touching mucous membranes. There are tiny little droplets that are airborne, especially in medical procedures. And so that's why if you go to your hospital or your doctor, many of us are wearing a mask and a face shield to not only protect you, but to protect us from possible sources of contamination through the eyes, as well as through the nose and mouth. Early on, there was an enormous number of studies talking about solid surface transmission of the disease, but it turns out that's probably less important, except in hospitals and clinics. The real culprit is droplets through oral communication. The next slide. The problem with this disease, you've heard about this many times, that the disease someone can transmit the disease very early on in the process, even before they have symptoms. And people, even after they've recovered, can shed the virus for up to 14 days. So there are many places that do quarantine people for 14 days. We isolate people in hospitals for 14 days. And it's important to remember that, and I put it in caps here, that transmission can occur in the absence of symptoms. I'm a pediatrician, and I know that children are carriers of large amounts of the virus without illness, and that's going to make it tricky to, well, it is making it tricky on determining how schools are restarting this fall. And so, the idea is that transmission increases in certain areas where personal protective equipment is not used. And that was originally in skilled nursing facilities, but also homeless shelters, prisons, cruise ships, and churches and synagogues. Most synagogues have been fairly responsible with this, but not all. And we know that this occurs after social gatherings, and our college students are proving this day after day, city after city, university after university, state after state. If we have the next slide. So we believe that people will develop an immunity. Some clearly do. It's going to be hard to know how to prove that for many people. There are antibody tests now. The virus is, the infected part is the antigen, the body's response is the antibody. There are antibody tests available. It's not known really how long those antibodies will be effective. They may be effective for a long period of time, they may be effective for a short period of time, but as Dr. Magnus said, we're learning as we go here, so we don't really know what the ability is to develop an immune responses and if it will be long lasting. And that will be one of the issues with the vaccine as well. Will we need 1 dose, 2 doses, 3 doses? And that will vary from how each vaccine is prepared to what the clinical trials show. It's important to remember, people always have asked me a million times about testing. Should I get tested? If you're not symptomatic, it probably doesn't pay to get tested because it's not going to change anything you do. If you're symptomatic and you can quarantine, it does pay to be tested. But there's a significant amount of confusion and delay in the testing. We don't have an ideal test. The ideal test really, is a pregnancy test. A little urine on the stick, and it's positive right then and there. It may not be perfect, but you have a good idea. We are a very long way from that. In Baltimore, the Baltimore County tests come back in 3 days, but if I send it through my hospital to one of the clinical labs, it could take a week. And this is just very unfortunate. It's very hard to do good public health with that kind of time lag between the time of the test and the time of the results. There's also variability in the types and results of each test, and how the tests come back to us in the clinical world as positive or negative, but somebody's made that decision along the way, and each lab has its own criteria for whether something is positive or negative. I know that sounds silly, but it is true based on the number of dilutions and things like that, far more than you want to know, far more than I'm really capable of explaining well. So if we can have the next slide. So the real key to this, and Dr. Magnus talked about this, is that it's really the management of exposed individuals are really key to this. The standards are in flux. The CDC came out with a bunch of recommendations in the last couple of weeks. State and local public health agencies did not agree with that, and it caused a lot of confusion in the hospitals, but we still do recommend that if someone is positive, that they're home quarantined for at least 10 days, probably 14 would be better. And then healthcare workers, though, actually early on were encouraged to stay home for the longest period of time. But since now personal protective equipment is ubiquitous and people are wearing masks and face shields, it's less likely that they're going to transmit it. So healthcare workers can come back quicker. And one of the reasons was that it still is, there's a big fear that if enough healthcare workers are exposed and quarantined, there just won't be anyone left in the hospital to care for sick patients. So we can have the next slide. I talked about testing, and I don't have much more to say about it, but The test that you hear about is PCR, polymerase chain reaction. It's a brilliant test that makes the virus multiply. It's sort of like described as sort of a microphone for the virus. You make more and more of it, and it becomes clearer that it's in place. So I've had several PCR tests that have been negative. I had an antibody test because it became available and it was non-diagnostic. So I'm not immune. And actually, I don't know anyone who is, except the few doctors I know who have had COVID infection themselves. If we can have the next slide. So I put this slide in. We've already talked about this many times, but social distancing is really important. Masks need to be worn properly. I know this is risky, but if you see someone who's not wearing a mask properly, you really have a social obligation to ask them to put the mask over their nose. You also have a personal obligation to protect yourself from those people who might not be pleased with your interfering in how they're wearing it. I do want to caution you that some masks are out there that have vents in it. They're designed for people who are wearing them. They make them feel better when they're wearing it because you can exhale through it. However, that is not protective for others. We ban them in the hospital. We've also put tape across them for some people who those are the only masks that fit. We cover up the vent so they can't exhale onto anyone else. Bandanas and neck gaiters are totally useless. They're single layers. They're the wrong fabric. They don't protect anyone. They don't protect yourself, and they don't protect anyone from getting it. So I would stay away from those. If we can have the next slide. As we talked about, there's no known medication that's proven completely effective or prevention of this disease. You've heard about hydroxychloroquine, you've heard about oleandrin. Both are dangerous and should not be used. And then the other methods that people have touted all over the web are gargling and hydrogen peroxide. Light therapy, radiation therapy are totally ineffective. Conventional therapy has dramatically changed for patients who are sick and in the hospital and on ventilators. Early on, people thought that this disease was exclusively pulmonary, and these patients were treated much like the SARS or MERS with vigorous high pressure ventilation. It turned out that was not the effective way to do it. What we've learned, and I'll talk about a little bit more later, is that conventional steroids and anticoagulation have really made a huge difference. And remdesivir is an antibody treatment, and it is somewhat effective in patients, but it's not. It's only partially effective. It will shorten the length of stay in the ICU, but it does not cure the disease. Now there are people experimenting with plasma therapy that's collected from people who've been infected in the past. One of my colleagues received it. She believes it shortened her course of the disease, and I think that's what the typical response is, but it's not been curative. So we have the next slide. Early on, people were so afraid of this disease that patients who had the disease were put into a COVID unit which was an ICU, and were not moved around the hospital for fear of spreading it around. So they did not get conventional diagnostic studies such as CT scans, but it became very clear that a CT scan, which is a 30 to 40-year-old instrument, became very effective in determining that this wasn't just a pneumonia. These were small clots throughout the body, that it became clear that adjunctive therapy was necessary. And that's why we started with anticoagulation and steroids. And those have really reduced the severity of the disease. In pediatrics, that's been a major advantage in treating what's come to be known as multi-organ inflammatory syndrome in children. Children were first thought to be less vulnerable than adults to getting severe disease. It turned out this spring there were a number of children who had it. There were a number of fatalities, although not a large number, but it became very clear that those children needed some other mode of therapy other than ventilation. And again, the steroids and anticoagulants, the Coumadins, those kinds of medications that we all see advertised on TV became very widely used. So we have the next one, please. Dr. Magnus talked about vaccines. There are many in development. it's expected, one of the difficulties that even if we find a good vaccine and it can be widely distributed, we need to make this pandemic go away. It's estimated we need 4 billion doses. And, that is quite a lift to get that dispersed around the country, let alone around the world. And so, there are plans that I've been told that are available, but not to release to the public yet, as to how this is going to be distributed, who's going to be the first recipients of it, and then how it's going to progress through the population. I can tell you that I will not be one of the first people to receive it by choice. I think that I'd like to see, a couple 100,000 people get it first before I get it, but I'm not on the front line. I'm not at highest risk for it, but those of my colleagues who are on the front line will be getting it early, and they should. So if we can have the next slide. And I'll come back to vaccines and the flu in a moment, but I just want to talk about children because people are very worried about that now with the return to schools. It's estimated that children represent only about 10% of the COVID cases, about almost 500,000 out of 5 million cases in the US. But in the last 2 weeks of August, children accounted for 17% of all cases. So it's definitely increasing in cases, and the return to school is probably going to make that rise even faster. And so I don't think we can have a one-size-fits-all plan for returning to school. We clearly haven't. Schools have opened and closed as a result of the fact that people have become infected. If we can have the next slide. This just emphasizes what I talked about. It's pretty clear the green line are the number of cases rising from 1 or 2% early April to over 10% of the cases as of the last week of August. And then the next slide reaffirms these are the number of childhood deaths. There were very, very few in the United States, no more than 100 childhood deaths. Most of them occur in the children between ages 10 and 17, although there have been young children who've passed away from this. So this can be a highly infectious and highly toxic disease. And the next slide. Schools, they're currently our biggest problem. The University of Alabama has 2,000 COVID positive children. I just finished speaking with one of the infection prevention people from a hospital in Kansas City. They said the state of Missouri, which had been relatively free of the disease, is now a very hot spot for it because of the college kids going. Although I will tell you, my alma mater, Wash U, only has 4 kids that are positive. So they taught us something there, taught us well, and they're hopefully still teaching the kids well. And it's very clear that media and government officials sort of misinterpreted pediatric data to show that children don't get sick. They're not virtually immune, as has been said in some areas. But kids do need to go to school, and no one wants to discourage them from going to school, but we need to do this scientifically, and we've got to try to base this on the safety of children, staff, and teachers. We can have the next one, please. So there is a next wave coming. The University of Washington predicts that it will be, the vectors will start to increase very quickly starting in November. If we've had 100,000 deaths or 200,000 deaths, I'm sorry, by the end of December, we're going to have 400,000 deaths, even if we continue doing what we're doing, because we're not all protecting ourselves and others very well. Schools are going to be a major source of this disease. Children do get the disease. In 1918, in the first wave, children were not affected, but they became victims in the second wave. And I think I know why now, because they are getting it from their parents, and now are going to be spreading it when they return back to school. So I think we need to be very careful of that. One of my patients, patients' mothers I've taken care of for a long time, is a public school teacher in the city of Baltimore. And, she said, they don't have soap in the bathroom. They don't have hand sanitizers. They certainly don't have masks. And, they've been discouraged from wearing face shields. And not all the students are good about wearing masks. Many are, but, we have to be very careful to try to protect all those critical workers. And, college dorms and fraternity houses need far better supervision, and they have to have truthful reporting of their cases. Some states and some schools are not truthful in their reporting for public relations issues. So we can go on. I think there's only a couple more left. So I do, before I end this, and this is, I was inspired Friday night by Deborah Winter. When will this end? If not now, when? Hopefully we'll never see this again. But in the interim, there's a big struggle to make the changes that we need. We need truth from our public health and governmental agencies. We need faith that our recommended protections, such as face masks, will be widely used and widely used appropriately. We need a scientifically validated and safe vaccine with equitable distribution. And we also need to take flu shots. This is an important issue. We need to take them as early as they're available. In the past, it was recommended to wait until a little later in the fall so it would last through the winter. That advice is out the window now. We want everyone to take a flu shot as soon as you possibly can, because the diseases are going to double up on each other. Their symptoms are very similar, especially in pediatrics. And it's going to be hard to know who's got what. And so the more you can do to protect yourself from any respiratory disease, the better off you are. Flu vaccines are not perfect. They may be 50% effective, but 50% is better than nothing. It's not a coin toss. It really makes a difference, and it lessens the severity of the disease. And so as we're working our way into, a worsening pandemic, and, on one of my calls today with the incident commanders of the University of Maryland system, we all predict that whatever we saw in the spring is going to be worse in the fall, but hopefully we'll be able to stave off some of the severe consequences. So no miracles are coming. As Dr. Magnus said, pandemics do end. We've seen them end, but it's going to take leadership and adherence to sound medical practice to make this a reality. And I think that is it for me. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I finally learned after 6 months how to unmute. Anyway, we're the ones thanking you, Richard and Manya. Those were fantastic presentations, super helpful. And Manya and Richard, I have good news and bad news for you. I guess I'll give you the good news first. Your presentations were really very well received with great interest. The bad news is we have so many questions you need to send out for breakfast right now, because we're going to be doing this for a while. So I'm going to scroll quickly through the questions. We have had, here's your breakfast, super. Deborah wanted me to mention that some of the questions came in via YouTube, but other ones came by other channels, for example, text messaging. So we really, really appreciate the engagement that we're getting this evening. So some of these may be a little bit redundant of things you guys have already said, but I still want to answer the questions if we can. So Richard just answered the first question we had, which was, when do you advise getting the flu shot? And I just want to reinforce that to say that, just to underscore what Richard already said so eloquently, and that is, in years gone by, in order to prolong the effectiveness of the flu shot, many of us advised our patients to hold off a little bit if they were not in highly vulnerable groups, but not this year. This year, we want people to get the flu shot as soon as possible. Flu shots are not perfect, but they're very, very helpful. And so that's the answer to that one. And that's really, really great. There's a couple of questions that I'm not sure I can answer, but I'm going to read them anyway. And Richard or Manya, you can jump in. This is a tough one. Why is the federal government still failed to protect people in nursing homes and assisted living as deaths continue to mount? The shortage of PPE equipment for effective rapid testing and regulation is lacking. I have to say that I've had some experience with relatives in my family being in skilled nursing facilities within the last several weeks, and it's a big, big concern. I don't want to speak for Richard or Manya. I can't answer why the federal government, any administration's federal government, does or doesn't do certain things, but I do think that we could have done better and still could do better in these facilities. Richard or Manya, any comments on this? You may be muted, Richard.
That was the right answer. The why of this is just beyond me to understand, to comprehend. We should have been better about this as a nation from very early on. We've been I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't say this like this, but we've been derelict in our duty to each other as a nation. And, you know, I think we tend to neglect our elderly in many ways. And there was no forethought as to how this was going to affect people who are in institutions, particularly in nursing homes. And, you know, and it's not just nursing homes now, it's prisons. And no matter what you think about people who are jailed, they deserve the right to live and deserve the right to live safely. And they're not. They're a great risk. And then you sort of move down to the other institutions. Why are we forcing schools to open if we don't have soap and water for teachers to wash their hands or PPE for them? So, you know, it's a systemic problem. It's not just the nursing homes. And, you know, I have a 104.5-year-old mother-in-law who's in a facility, and she's been alone for the last 7 months. Because they've really done a good job of trying to protect her. But, you know, that's not the way I envision spending the end of my life, being alone in my room for 7 months. But that's what we've resorted to because we have not provided the right PPE. Now, her nursing home has done a great job, so I don't want to be caught off guard there.
Well, you know, we've had the same experience in our family, Richard, and although it's heartbreaking, those that are doing the best job in a way break your heart because they're being very, very careful about following the rules. Now, here's another question for you, Richard, if you would. How far away from are we from instant reliable tests? And I just want to remind everybody what Richard already had in his slide, that we have the PCR test, which is our most accurate test. It takes a while to come back, especially if it's sent to a high throughput lab. And then we have the antigen tests, like the ones that he mentioned, like for a strep throat or other things. And so how far are we from these instant tests being reliable? And could you perhaps comment on the false negative rate of those tests? So
that, you know, those are really key questions that I don't know that anyone has a good answer to. We don't know. We've been very close with some of the commercial manufacturers about getting a reliable PCR test, but they don't have enough reagents. There weren't for a long time. There weren't enough swabs. And there were lots of technical issues that prevent that from happening. The test is reliable. It just takes a little bit of time and it's bulky. The antigen tests people are working on, we're promised that we're going to have them this fall. I don't know that that's going to be the case. I know there's still production problems with those as well. So, you know, this was not ramped up quite the way the United States was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, where everything went into mass production. We've just not been able to do that. And it's relying on individual companies to do this, and some are better than others in trying to produce them. And, you know, we've not had, you know, and the fact that the federal government forced the governors of each state to develop this on their own has really compromised our ability to provide those tests and swabs and kits on an immediate basis. So I don't have an answer to that. It's the real answer to that question is I don't have an answer.
That's fair enough.
Can I just
Manya,
chime in on that?
Please.
I think one thing that's really interesting is there's the remarkable testing technology is happening. And if we do get these antigen tests, which even if they're not quite as sensitive, so they don't pick up quite as many positives out there, the whole reliance on testing technology, it's not enough. What we need is a national strategy in order to identify ways of getting those tests into people's hands. And I think that the real way the antigen tests could be great. Even if we miss 3% of all the positives, if every person is taking an antigen test because it's cheap and easy and at home, and they do it every day, every person, every time they leave, we don't need a vaccine. We could identify and quickly quarantine and section off people who are ill and get them right into care. So I think that the problem, and a part of our national strategy, is we have no national strategy. So technology can't pull us out of this. What we really need is how to use the technology. And those antigen tests, a PCR test, if we can widely disseminate them, we might have a real shot at even before a vaccine or an effective treatment. But without a real strategy for use of those tests, it will be just as ad hoc as anything else. So I just want to highlight that even if people develop the test, it's not the answer. The answer is how we use the test and how we all decide public health wise to use it.
So don't go anywhere, Manya, because we have a couple more coming your way. Okay. But I'm sorry to say that I have to agree with what you said about the lack of a cohesive national strategy. And for whatever it's worth, the organization that I lead, the AAMC, we put out a roadmap for the nation about a month ago, about 5 weeks ago. And if anybody listening here would like to take a look at it, it's freely available publicly. It's at aamc.org, aamc.org. And you just look for the COVID roadmap, and it tries to cover some of these. But Manya, since you're here, here's a question for you. Is there evidence of the virus itself mutating as it has moved through different populations?
So I'm going to punt on that, but I am going to actually say your roadmap that you made was fabulous. I encourage everyone to read it. I think it was really one of the most important documents I've seen. So I think it would be wise if we followed that. So just kudos to you on that great job. As far as I know, but I'm actually going to defer to Dr. Katz and to you, but there's no real evidence that there's such viral mutation or viral shift happening that we should be really alarmed about. But as I said before, and as we all kind of agree, we don't know what will happen next. And I think that the story's still out. What we think today is different tomorrow. But I'm going to see if Richard has another comment on that.
I mean, the only comment I have is that there was one patient in Hong Kong who was thought to get it twice, and probably from 2 different strains of the virus. I don't know if that means it was a genetic shift, or if it was a mutation, or if it was an error. I mean, it's just hard to know. So I hated seeing that. Because that means immunity is going to be much harder to develop. So we're just going to have to wait and see. And it hasn't been replicated anywhere else. So we're just going to have to wait and see.
Now, I want to do a little something different, a little lightning round of questions to Richard and Manya, because we have so many interesting and provocative questions. So on some of these, if you can give me a thumbs up or thumbs down and move along to the next question. But if you want to say a few words, that's good. Should we keep wiping down groceries or packages? Thumbs down. And I have to agree with that. So this virus is really transmitted by air, by you're breathing out, talking, coughing, singing, etc. And so I have to admit, I want to be open about this in public. I was wiping down everything on earth when the thing first started. But my wife, who's the source of most of the wisdom in our place, has convinced me not to do that. Next one. Are the panelists going out to restaurants? Aha, so we have a split vote here. So Richard says absolutely not with his thumb. Manya says you bet. And I'm betting that Manya, you bet, goes along with eating outside and socially distancing.
Right.
And,
yeah.
I'm an old codger, so I'm in a vulnerable population on that basis. But I have to admit, I've been out a few times to outdoor places where the tables are far apart and the waiters are wearing masks. And in fact, one of the establishments I went to the other day in Georgetown, they actually took my name and phone number in case contact tracing had to be done, which I thought was pretty cool. Okay, next one, dentist. Would you go to a dentist, Richard or Manya? Yes, me too. And the thing you have to remember is that the healthcare workforce and the offices and hospitals and clinics have developed fantastic mechanisms to deal with this early on, largely because we were overwhelmed by the caseload in some locations. Many elective procedures were canceled, but now it's okay to do that. Eye doctor, Manya and Richard, eye doctor, okay, both thumbs up on that one. Now here's a tougher one. Hairstylist, Richard and Manya, hairstylist.
Cut my own hair, so I have to say no to that. But
Okay.
I've had one haircut professionally in 6 months when I couldn't cut my own hair in the back. So, and they were very good about it. It was an individual room. There was nobody else, nobody waiting. I wore my mask the whole time. She wore her mask the whole time. I didn't get it. I didn't get COVID, so I guess it was okay.
Manya?
I think, to be honest, like I would go, we actually, going back to restaurants, we have gone inside places, but it all depends on the practices. So a little investigation, and are people wearing masks? And same with our son went to get his haircut. I think very prudent investigation, and then deciding to do things safely. It can be done, especially if people are wearing masks.
I have the more brilliant solution, which is my genetics. There's nothing going on up here, so no need for a hairstylist, but that's another story. Now, here's one I think perhaps for Richard. Are antibody tests reliable? Just talking about antibody tests.
They seem to be, but they're not very useful for the most part now. So they seem, when you get a negative result, it seems to be reliable. If you have a positive result, it seems to be reliable, but the jury's still out on that. I got my antibody test as part of a study through the university. And so they're going to be looking at that based on the number, and they're going to look at it based on the number of cases that I was exposed to. And they're looking at everyone else in terms of who was exposed to a possible patient with COVID and looking and see if there's any relation. So that jury is still out.
So just got a question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Manya, please.
Oh, no, just briefly to follow up. I think part of it also is if you're in a high prevalence population, like healthcare workers, the chance of a false positive is less, but in a low prevalence population, just the way those numbers work out, and I won't get all wonky on you, actually you can end up with about 50-50 chance of it being truly representing you were exposed and not.
Yeah.
So people in the general population, it doesn't really help a lot. And it actually can be dangerous because if you get a positive and you think, oh, I'm not at risk, then you might behave differently. So it's not hard. It's not hard to see how it's dangerous or can be.
I want to speak on behalf of the congregation. Wonky is good. We like wonky at Temple Micah, so that's fine. That's cool. Now, Richard, this is one for you. Is it mandatory for licensed physicians practicing in DC and their staff, just pretend for a moment you're in DC, to wear masks and PPE when they're examining patients? Is it mandatory?
It's not mandatory, at least in the state of Maryland. I can't speak for DC, but it's nowhere that I know of is it mandatory. But it would be foolish for them not to be wearing it. And for me, I would call into question their sincerity in maintaining a healthy environment if they're not wearing a mask. Their job is to treat you and to protect you simultaneously.
Perfect. Okay, now here's a sort of a reprise of something you already commented on, Richard, but I want to have a little more fulsome answer from you and Manya. At what point will the panelists get COVID vaccine? So Richard, if you want to repeat what you had said about not wanting to be an early adopter.
Yeah, I don't. I've been an early adopter in other vaccines that I thought might have been riskier. In fact, I was one of the early recipients of the hepatitis B vaccine when it was from pooled blood, and I was very confident in that. Now, no one would do that, but I'm just leery about this rapid push. Most vaccines take years and years to develop. There may be new technology that'll make it better, faster, and as safe, but I don't know that yet. And with so many competing companies, there's so much money at stake in this that, until I know that they've really done adequate phase 3 trials and that enough people have gotten the vaccine, that there haven't been post-trial complications, I would want to wait. And, I'm a pediatrician, I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist. Babies got a vaccine for rotavirus, and it went through the testing very well. But then after about 10,000 babies got the vaccine and found out they had severe complications requiring surgery and death. So we need to be very thoughtful about when we get these vaccines. Now, if I were in the emergency room or if I were in the ICU managing those patients, I would have a totally different feel about it. I would probably run that risk, knowing that the risk of the disease was worse than the complications of a potentially bad vaccine. So, it's variable.
Thank you. Manya, any thoughts on when you might get the vaccine?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely have the benefit of working on one of the trials, and I'm a deep believer. I've worked on a lot of biomedical prevention trials for HIV in the past. So I'm a big believer in the randomized control trial. These trials are well designed, and from everything I've seen so far, the ones at least that we're involved with through the CoVPN and the NIH oversight they've actually done everything that I expect a vaccine trial to do. I follow the science. I'm interested in whether people are taking shortcuts, and so far I have not seen any shortcuts from my one site vantage point. So when will I get the vaccine? So there are two questions in my mind. One is it safe? And two, does it work? And those are different questions. You can have something that's safe that doesn't do anything, and then you have the behavioral problem that you think something works and it doesn't. It's like the false positive antibody test. So to me, I want to try something when I see the data as being safe and effective, and the efficacy has to be outweigh the risk of whatever side effects that we identify as potential side effects. So Will I believe it? It'll depend on what happens with the data. Right now, this trial have about 30,000 people in each of the studies, and they'll be followed for 2 years. So we should expect that in 2 years, over 30,000 people per study, we would be able to identify whether it's safe and whether it works, assuming the peak of the epidemic doesn't change. And we have enough outcomes to be able to see if there's a difference. But again, it will all come down to the science and the data. It's not politics. It's not what we want. We all want it to work. It's not whether there's, doses available. It does not matter. They can manufacture it. It's not whether it's cheap. It's whether it's safe and whether it's effective. But if the data show that it's safe and effective, I would take it after everybody who is at greater risk than I am had access to it. And I think that's the key. Equitable allocation of the vaccine to those people on the front lines will be critical. And I know the National Academy of Sciences is having a whole equitable allocation workshop that they just put out for comment. So it'll be critical that we follow the science and we have the people most at risk get it first, and then I'd get it. But I would get it based on what I'm seeing.
Very, very thoughtful. And I want to underscore something that both of the panelists have commented on from different perspectives, and that is the idea of risk stratification. So Richard said, well, if I were in the ICU or the emergency department, and I was face to face all the time with it, I might get it. And Manya is eloquently referring to the idea that we all have a different risk profile. So those are us who are, a little older like I am, or those who have conditions, autoimmune conditions in which there's immune response problems. It's a complicated calculus. And one thing I predict will be hard for the panelists to make a decision on is, even if you're involved in a trial, is if something is released in the next 6 weeks or so, which we've been hearing about this week, will there be enough time to have the answer of efficacy and safety? And, time will tell. Manya, any comments on that? We've heard a lot about how there's some hope or promises that a vaccine might be released for general use within the next 6 weeks.
I think that's highly unlikely. I'd be shocked, but if that happened, I'd want to see the data, and I hope that there's a big push to data transparency. Stranger things have happened. If everyone in the placebo arm was hospitalized with COVID and no one in the vaccine arm, they have a certain number of events that we have to have experienced in order for us to see whether there's a statistical difference between the two groups. And if the statistical numbers turn out such that it really shows an impact and there's no sign of a signal of danger, that would be, surprising to me, very surprising to me. I don't think the vaccine I'm working on would have had accrued enough person time for that to be the case. And the Moderna trial is the first trial to have actually gotten this far along. But at the same time, the data are the thing. And so I think we all have to push accountability of our public people at FDA, and as well as we really have to ask for transparency and data. I wouldn't do something if I didn't see the data.
Yeah.
Manya, would you comment about the AstraZeneca issue today that's been released this week?
Please.
About them stopping their trials because of the adverse event, that's a normal part of studies, but
Yes.
it needs clarification.
Actually, to be honest, in terms of the question of the political influence onto the approval process for the vaccines, that pause made me happier than anything I've seen.
Yes.
Studies should be paused when there's adverse events that people don't understand. That's what we typically would do. It happens all the time when I've been working on different trials. It's what we want to see. It means someone's looking. It means we care. It means we stop. I saw all these posts about Wall Street Journal and shares, but it doesn't matter what the shares are. That has nothing to do with it. That showed that this is a typical normal vaccine process. We would expect to see adverse events, and we would expect to see pauses in data collection. So actually, I was really reassured by that. I don't know anything about the AstraZeneca trials beyond what I read in the public, literature. But in terms of a trial design, I was very happy to see that.
Yeah.
Very, very, very important point. Thank you for making that point. And also in that regard, those who are listening, you may hear the term pause, you may hear the term hold. Sometimes they call it a clinical hold. It's a sign that the trial is being done right, that it's being done professionally. Okay, a couple lightning round questions. For our still very vigorous, you guys have plenty of steam, I can see it from here. Would you take an airplane flight? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Sort of, it
Thumb-
depends.
Now you can't say it depends.
But yeah, no, because you talk about risk stratification, right?
Right.
If I have to go somewhere and that's the only way to go, I would do it. If I have to go somewhere, would I do it? Would I take a flight for a vacation? Would take a long flight, something that probably not. And I can only tell you what I've done with my life. I had to go visit my grandchildren in Wisconsin. We drove, but I've had to go to Florida for a family member needed a medical procedure. We flew. So, but we wore a shield and we wore masks, and, I felt sort of wonky doing that, but yes, so I did it, and I would do it, but it depended on the risk.
Manya, do you want to comment more on your thumbs up?
I'm feeling, as a lot of people are, there's a mental health push to have some type of vacation. And I do dream of some type of beach situation. So I think if my mental health needed it and our families did, I probably would go for it. I wouldn't do it without careful consideration of my behavior and where I was going. But I do dream of that beach.
I've been very conservative for our vacation, which just ended a few days ago, although it seems like it never happened now. What we did was hang around here, do all the wonderful things you can do around the DC area, and sort of did those things, but didn't actually jump on a plane. Now, here's a tough one. And this is going to be another lightning round for you two. We're so blessed at Temple, Micah, with his fabulous rabbis that we have and the interns and so on. Our wonderful Rabbi Baraha asked the question, positive predictions for high holy days in 2021. A year from now, are you predicting we will be together in our wonderful sanctuary or elsewhere for services around this time of the year? Thumbs up or thumbs down? A year from now.
It's a
I'm
good.
Give it a cautious thumbs up.
Well,
But don't quote me because things change, but
yeah,
cautious thumbs up.
I've been accused of being such a negative ninny about this, but yeah, I think we'll be done by then.
Yeah, and I the reason I'm enthusiastic about it, as well, enthusiastic probably too strong a word, but I'll give you a thumbs up, is that these trials are happening with the vaccines. We're learning about the virus every day. It's not a mistake that it's called a novel coronavirus. It's the first time we've known about this one affecting humans. And so, Rabbi Baraha, I hope that gives you a little bit of comfort for the fact that the three of us suggested to the rabbi that we don't do in-person high holy days this year. Now, here's a question for either of you. Maybe I'll start out with Richard, if that's okay. Is there additional risk to acquiring a COVID infection for pregnant women? And what about the baby?
So just this week, there was an article showing that pregnant women who get COVID are more likely to deliver premature babies. Now, I have not seen the data of that, but I caught that as an abstract somewhere. And the difficulty early on was for the unknown pregnant women who, they knew they were pregnant, but they didn't know that they had COVID and delivered. And then there was some question about transmission postnatally to the baby, and that did happen. And those babies were isolated. The babies were separated from their mothers. What the OBs have done now is to have quarantined the mothers, generally if they can plan it, for 14 days prior to delivery, and make sure that they've been COVID tested and negative, and then they can keep the babies together. Now, all that said, we have a baby coming to our hospital tomorrow who was a premature baby whose mother was a substance abuser, who was premature probably because mother was COVID positive. But we don't know that for a fact, and we're going to be managing that baby for quite some time. So yes, there's probably some risk, but not as much as was initially thought.
Now, here's a tough one for both of you. You notice that I always volunteer to be the moderator, so I can throw the real tough ones to you guys. Otherwise, I would be a panelist if I got the pop flies, but you guys got the line drives. So to both Richard and Manya, a really tough question. What metric will be used to determine that the pandemic has ended? What metric? Let's start with Manya. Let's put her in the hot seat first.
I think everybody by now is tracking their data locally. So I think as we see, assuming that testing stays elevated, but that the proportion of tests starts going down, that will be a sign. The fewer tests, the fewer people that are reported positive, but all of that depends, all those counts depend on an adequate public health response, which we do, and we may not have in every single place. That will help. I would be personally happy to see everyone in masks. We know that masks do a better job of protecting us. Up to 75 to 95% of transmission can be interrupted just by wearing a mask. And that's way better than any vaccine we have. So if we get the tests out, the national testing strategy, we get people in masks and our percent positivity rate goes down and our proportion of testing goes up, I would think we're on our way to ending the pandemic here.
What a wonderful, wonderful answer. Thank you. Richard, what do you think?
I would agree with that. I have my own personal metric, though, that I don't know if it's validated in science, but when I count the number of people who are in ICU beds, figuring that is probably the most reliable measure of someone's illness. And when the number of ICU patients decreases, then I'll know that we're on the right track.
Makes sense.
Decreases and stays down, right?
And stays down.
Yeah,
Stays down.
very, very, very helpful. And so, you know, the difficulty giving a single metric, this is a really important question one of our friends asked, shows that this is a multifaceted problem, that a lot of things have to go into the thinking. And I think that both of your answers, that is evidence, Richard's evidence of a very severe outcome, as well as Manya's evidence of the degree of positivity of testing, is very, very important. One thing that deals into Manya's answer is that, and she said it already, I just want to underscore what she already said clearly, and that is, that's assuming that testing stays at a high level. And so, you know, if testing is very inadequate, the positivity rate will probably go up, but we have to keep pushing to have a very robust testing environment, which in my opinion, we still don't have enough right now. Our organization estimated that we would need between 2 and 3 million tests a day to have positivity values down below 5%, but that's one feature. Well, actually, we have amazingly gone through all the questions that we've received. I'm looking very, very quickly in the chat file here, very quickly, make sure we didn't skip anyone, because these were fantastic, fantastic questions. By the way, Richard and Manya, there's a lot of kudos for you two in here. And I'm not reading them, but just telling you that you guys did a great job. Not only do I think it, but the people we're here to share it with think so as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Oh, here's a new one. Here's a new question. I knew that see, Deborah Winter, you think she's like a really nice person. She doesn't want us to sleep tonight. She wants us to keep doing it, which is cool. How trustworthy is the data reporting now that info is filed with the White House instead of the CDC? So this is a question about hospital data being sent to not so much the White House, I think
HHS.
It's HHS, rather than the CDC. Richard and Manya, I'd like you both take a whack at that. Richard, do you want to start?
Are we allowed to talk politics?
Well, talk science in a way that we'll understand what you mean.
Yeah, I think the CDC has historically shown that they've been a reliable organization for collecting this data. And I think they know how to process it. They think they know what to do with it. And I think people until this year have greatly respected the CDC for its lack of political influence and its trustworthiness. So I think it's problematic that the data was taken from the CDC and put into the executive branch.
Manya?
Yes to what he said. All I can say is that as an epidemiologist, my biggest dream was to work at CDC. That, you know, you want to work at CDC or NIH, and we all want to go do the job of epidemiologists with CDC. And it's sad to see the political influence has made their credibility go down so much. It's a great disappointment. But I am hopeful that one day the CDC, the data will live at the CDC, and we will be able to track epidemics the way we should in that location. Data are not political. Data are data, and they've made it political. So it's quite disappointing, but I hope it changes in the next administration.
And you know, if I could just add, I completely agree with what you said, Manya, but if I could just add one thing, the people down in the rank and file of the CDC are fantastic people,
Yes.
super highly trained, dedicated, devoted experts in what they do. There's nothing quite like it on planet Earth that I'm aware of. So I hope people will understand that it's super important to recognize that the crowd that's been there a while is going to be there a while, and day in, day out is doing I'm going to say thankless work of just detective work and so on in all these agencies are really doing fantastic work. And I wouldn't want to see their good work, sort of tarnished. So All right.
I wouldn't want to disparage the rank and file of the HHS either.
Exactly. All of them, all the
that's not them. It's
yeah.
the leadership.
Yeah, even the rank and file of this panel, which is Richard and Manya, we don't want to disparage. You guys are doing great. So listen, we're going to wrap it up now. Thank you again to Richard and Manya. I'm going to give you a single applause from me right here, but everybody's applauding behind me. And Rabbi Zemmel and Deborah and Rachel, thank you for setting this up, and thanks everybody for participating as attendees. Thank you for the wonderful, wonderful questions. And Rabbi Zemmel, back to you, and thank you very much for letting us share the evening.
Well, thank you to all of you. This has simply been extraordinary. Someone texted me the following as a way of saying thank you on behalf of our entire Micah community. Quote unquote, I've listened to many videos by COVID experts. You three are by far superior to any I've heard. Deep thanks. Just deep, deep, deep thanks. My good friend Richard Katz, who I've known for many, many years, you've more than earned that Nutri-Grain bar, which I saw you surreptitiously take out of your cabinet. So yeah, show it to us. This is dinner on the job. If you're working at a hospital in Baltimore, this is what it means to be a Hopkins doctor, eh? Okay. So, and I see you, David, taking a drink. So thank you all. Manya, this has simply been wonderful. I want to thank Rachel Gross for being behind the scenes, as you so often are, and helping with the tech. And of course, Deborah, thank you so much. As a way of kind of not so much as a closing prayer, but a closing thought, and then I'll turn things over to Deborah. I'm going to read a selection from an essay that David Grossman, a great writer in Israel, wrote about this period of time that we're living through, that I came across recently in reading the Israeli press. This is an essay that was published in one of the Israeli newspapers, or an excerpt from an essay in one of the Israeli newspapers by David Grossman. Perhaps when people come to look at all the distorted creations of our affluent, congested society, they will want to vomit. Perhaps the banal and innocent thought will suddenly occur to them that it is awful that there are people who are so rich and others who are so poor. That it is awful that a world that is so rich and satiated does not have an equal opportunity to every baby that is born. Are we not all one infectious human tissue, as we have discovered in these recent months? Is not the well-being of every human being ultimately in our interest, all of us collectively? Indeed, the well-being of the planet on which we live is in our interest, to our benefit, the clarity of the air that we breathe, and our children's future. This is what we must all dedicate our lives to. This is what it means to honor the past and truly care for the future. So thank you to all of you. We owe you so much as being healthcare workers on the front lines and supporting those who are on the front lines and doing their research that will help heal the world. Thank you so much. And Deborah, as I love to say, take us home with your beautiful music.
Thank you, Danny. And thank you to our panelists. Richard, you mentioned that I inspired you for your last slide. You have now inspired me. We will join together in one final song to close. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. Although there will be struggle, we'll make the change we can. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. So we'll work until it's done every person, everyone, every soul that's ever longed for something better, something brighter. It will take a change of heart for this to end. It will take a change of heart for this to end. But miracles do happen every shining now and then. If not now, if not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. May we never see this moment or place in time again.